Anyone familiar with Roman history is probably familiar with the old line that the Romans created a wasteland and then called it peace, or the Romans created a desert and then called it peace. It's a great line, and I want to get into what it means and how it gets interpreted. But first, I think the context of where this line comes from is interesting. This line comes supposedly from a general in Britain by the name of Calchas. So as the Romans are conquering the areas around them, expanding their empire, somewhere around the 80s AD, the Romans are conquering Britain, and they run into this guy, Calchas, who is preparing to fight them, and he gives this speech, supposedly, to motivate his men and get ready to fight the Romans. And the speech is recorded by Roman historian Tacitus, so we should probably take it with a grain of salt anyway, but here's what Tacitus has Calchas saying. And again, supposedly he's giving this speech to his troops in order to fight off the Romans who are invading. He says, quote, "Whenever I consider the origin of this war and the necessities of our position, I have a sure confidence that this day and this union of yours will be the beginning of freedom to the whole of Britain. To all of us, slavery is a thing unknown. There are no lands beyond us, and even the sea is not safe, menaced as we are by a Roman fleet. And thus, in war and battle, in which the brave find glory, even the coward will find safety. Former contests in which, with varying fortune, the Romans were resisted, still left in us a last hope of succor. Inasmuch as being the most renowned nation of Britain, dwelling in the very heart of the country and out of sight of the shores of the conquered, we could keep even our eyes unpolluted by the contagion of slavery. To us who dwell on the uttermost confines of the earth and of freedom, this remote sanctuary of Britain's glory has up to this time been a defense. Now, however, the furthest limits of Britain are thrown open, and the unknown always passes for the marvelous. But there are no tribes beyond us, nothing indeed but waves and rocks, and the yet more terrible Romans, from whose oppression escape is vainly sought by obedience and submission. Robbers of the world, having by their universal plunder exhausted the land, they rifle the deep. If the enemy be rich, they are rapacious. If he be poor, they lust for domination. Neither the East nor the West has been able to satisfy them. Alone among men, they covet with equal eagerness poverty and riches. To robbery, slaughter, plunder, they give the lying name of empire. They make a solitude and call it peace." End quote. So there's the great line at the end. And one interpretation of what he's saying here is that, look, we are people in Britain. We have what we would call our own autonomy and freedom. And the Romans are going to come in here. They're going to steamroll us. They're going to enforce taxation and obedience and slavery. And it's going to be terrible. But to the Romans, they're just going to call that expansion. They're going to call it empire. They're going to build roads, expand trade, beef up the infrastructure. And then once that process is done or close to being done, they're going to say, hey, look how great the empire is. And look how we brought civilization to these barbarian people on the outskirts of this empire. And we're going to forget about all the negatives of violence and slavery and submission that we've imposed on these people, but we're going to remember the building of the roads and the infrastructure and the trade and the peaceful benefits of conquest. So Calchas saw this a mile away, and he's hitting on one of the big themes of imperial history and really just history in general. And really, quite simply, the idea is, how do we remember things in the past, and how should we remember things? Should we remember the brutal conquest and the slavery and all of the negative aspects of that conquest? Or should we remember the Pax Romana, the period of peace and prosperity that brought architecture and art and commerce and trade and inspiration for millions of people that would come after? What's more important, the period of peace or the period of war? And how much of both should we factor into our historical analysis of something like the Roman Empire or things like it? It seems that oftentimes the complexity of situations like this can be a little bit too much for people. And one of the strategies to easily remember things in the past is to put them into a narrative that makes sense. And oftentimes, narratives that make sense have dichotomies: good and bad, black and white, rich and poor. So oftentimes, what you get in these narratives are this person was a good leader or a bad leader. This state was at war or they were at peace. This country was prosperous or it wasn't. These dichotomies make history a little bit easier to digest, and they allow us to piece together a historical narrative. But as someone like Calcagus might say, if you believe what he's saying there is what he believed and what is accurate, he might say that these simple dichotomies get us further from the truth. Because in reality, when you look at a time period like the Pax Romana or the Pax Mongolica, or these so-called peaceful periods in history, there's still war and conquest going on. It's going to be hard to find a stretch of more than a couple years in Roman history where there isn't some sort of war or imperialism or oppression going on. Oftentimes, it's just not deemed big enough to go into the history books. And again, oftentimes, things get simplified in order to fit into the narrative. So given all of that, it's a totally reasonable question to ask, how do we know anything in history, or how do we get at the truth? Well, if you ask a historian, they would say there's a process to this. And I've done an episode on this before that you can check out, but I do think it's useful to think of history more as a process than something like facts and figures that are set in stone. Historians piece things together from a number of different sources. They look at different types of speculation and perspective. They look at fields from archaeology to economics to art, literature, all kinds of different sources of information to try to put things together and hope to get as close to the truth as is possible. Although it's probably impossible to truly get there 100%, especially further back in history, the further back you go. But all of these questions of historical narrative and historical truth and the process of history and how do we really know anything about the past, I couldn't help but think about these questions as I was reading George R.R. Martin's 2018 book, Fire and Blood. This book was certainly not the book that most people wanted. We still haven't gotten that book, by the way. And the book is also different than anything George R. R. Martin has done before. So any fan of the Song of Ice and Fire books, which inspired the Game of Thrones television show, will know that there's 5 books so far in the series. Fans are hoping for a 6th book, but the books are fantasy, political intrigue, and there's characters and dialogue and plot. And it's sort of written like a typical fantasy book. But Fire and Blood is not that. It's a prequel to the events of the books and the TV show, but it's written like a history book. It covers about 150 years of fake history, and it gives a lot of context and acts as a bit of a prequel to the books, like we said, and maybe even the TV show House of the Dragon, which you might have seen. But because of the way that the book is different than the other books in the series, and I think it's fair to say that not a lot of fans were asking for this one, this book got overlooked a little bit. I myself was someone who skipped it for a while and wasn't really super interested in reading about it for all the reasons that I outlined. But recently I did check it out, and I actually haven't been this interested in a book in a long time because I think it's very interesting just from the perspective of being a fan of the world that George R. R. Martin has created and fantasy books in general. But the way that George R. R. Martin creates this historical world, and as someone who's read a lot of history books, there's something about the book, something about the way it's written that is really cool and really appealing to fans of history, I think. So the book as a whole demonstrates what I'm going to be talking about here, but there's also these little bits and pieces that are sprinkled throughout that make it clear that George R. R. Martin really understands how history works, and he understands the process of history. He understands that history is not set in stone. He gets how these debates about when and how things happen are important. He understands that depending on who is writing history and when they're writing it, that impacts how things are remembered. And he understands that history is not static. It's dynamic, it's fluid, it's always moving, and that it matters for a lot of reasons. I'm going to be talking about this in the context of a lot of the different themes of history and historical study, but here's a line from the book that I think just obviously illustrates that George R. R. Martin knows what's going on. He says, quote, "The Iron Throne was forged with fire and steel and terror, it is said. But once the throne had cooled, it became the seat of justice for all Westeros." End quote. So there's your line right there. The Romans created a wasteland and called it peace. The Iron Throne was forged with violence and terror, but now it's the seat of justice. George R. R. Martin opens his book with what's called Aegon's Conquest. And this is sort of similar to maybe William the Conqueror, or maybe even something like the Roman conquest of Britain. But again, the idea is that this conquering army takes over with dragons and terror and fire and blood. But over time, that stuff starts to fade away, and politics, economics, legacy, court dynamics, these become the topics of historical study. I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but I think this is a theme of historical study that George R. R. Martin is trying to get at in Fire and Blood. The idea is that, much like George's girlfriend in Seinfeld, oftentimes, historically speaking, ancient atrocities can get yada, yada, yada. There's not a lot of historical study in high school about Roman conquest and genocide and violence and submission and slavery, but kids do learn about the aqueducts and the road system and the Republican system of government and some of these other things. So in history, ancient atrocities tend to get glossed over, while sometimes more modern atrocities don't. Here's George R. R. Martin early on in his book, sort of yada, yada, yada-ing some atrocities in this vein. Quote, "Aegon Targaryen was not a man to accept defeat. The war would drag on for another 7 years, though after 6 AC, the fighting degenerated into an endless bloody series of atrocities, raids, and retaliations, broken up by long periods of inactivity, a dozen short truces, and numerous murders and assassinations." End quote. The question of why some of the negative aspects of a conquest like this, or some of the ancient atrocities that get glossed over, why that stuff happens in historical narrative, is an interesting question to ask. And there might be valid and practical reasons for excluding or including some of this type of stuff, depending on your audience and depending on what the story that you're trying to tell is. But either way, George R. R. Martin identifies this in his book as certainly a theme of the historical process. Another theme that George R. R. Martin hits on is the idea of counterfactual in history. Because oftentimes it's not enough just to say what happened. You also have to speculate a little bit and say why what happened changed what could have happened. Because oftentimes what did happen only matters because of what it prevented or what it caused. But because of that, it's often impossible to prove or really know for sure what didn't happen, which can make the process of this idea of counterfactual history difficult to do. George R.R. Martin, writing through the so-called author of Fire and Blood, one of the historians of the world of Westeros, says, quote, "Here is a quandary every student of history must face. When looking back upon things that happened in years past, we can say this and this and this were the causes of what occurred. When looking back on things that did not happen, however, we can only surmise." End quote. This idea of counterfactual history all over the place in Fire and Blood, and it's one of the most fun avenues of historical study. Another theme of history that I think gets overlooked, but I think is really important to understand if you want to understand history, is the idea of human nature. Oftentimes, I will see people or students who look back at history as if these people are alien somehow, almost like they're a totally different species of human because they lived so far back in the past that it becomes impossible or difficult to understand why they did what they did or what they did. And I think by and large, this is a big mistake. I think the study of history is more fruitful if you look at human nature as something that really hasn't changed that much over the course of maybe even thousands of years. The people in ancient Rome were just as human as you and me. Obviously, the environment and the culture and all of the surrounding circumstance is going to be way different back then than it is now, but we're still dealing with human beings even when we talk 2,000 years in the past. The actors and the props may change, but human nature largely remains intact. And if we understand that the history that we're studying is filled with humans, then that can give us some insight into their motivations and their behaviors. George R.R. Martin gets at this a little bit in his book, and I know that he's also a fan of the old William Faulkner line that says something along the lines of, "The human heart in conflict with itself is the only conflict worth writing about." Basically, the idea that there is good and there is evil in all of us, and that struggle to figure out which is which, and that struggle to be our best, and that struggle not to succumb to our nature or maybe to our baser instincts and behaviors, that struggle is what makes us human. In the book, he says, quote, "All men are sinners. The fathers of the faith teach us that. Even the noblest of kings and the most chivalrous of knights may find themselves overcome by rage and lust and envy and commit acts that shame them and tarnish their good names. And the vilest of men and the wickedest of women likewise may do good from time to time, for love and compassion and pity may be found in even the blackest of hearts. We are as the gods made us," wrote Septon Barth, the wisest man ever to serve as the hand of the king. "Strong and weak, good and bad, cruel and kind, heroic and selfish. Know that if you would rule over the kingdom of men." End quote. And I think know that if you would study history. Another historical theme that percolates throughout the book is the idea of how should history be taught? Should it be taught as a great man history that summarizes leaders and generals and politicians, people who are famous and in the limelight, analyzing their strengths and weaknesses, their policies, their behaviors? Or should it focus more on the environment and the unseen forces and systems and trends that tend to influence behavior? How much do you focus on the big picture if you're telling a story versus how much do you get into the little personality quirks and the small things that make people tick? How much do those little personality traits impact the big picture and the trends and forces that are acting on those personality traits, and vice versa? I think this is another one of those questions that you should be asking if you're a serious student of history. And I think George R. R. Martin actually does a little bit of both in this book here, which is what I think makes it so interesting. Obviously, you're going to get discussion of kings and dragons and some of these larger than life great men and women of history and their personality traits and the affairs and the romances and the battles. All that stuff is amazing. Some of these characters are inspirational. Some of them are hilarious. Some of them are hilariously stupid. And you can see in the book the impact that one especially cruel leader can have, rippling out terror and pain for generations of people. But what I also like is that George R. R. Martin doesn't forget about the other side of things. He talks about the role of religion. There's a whole section in the book that reminds me of the Protestant Reformation, and it really looks at the impact that religion has on ordinary people as well as leaders, and how leaders can use religion and how religious leaders can use political leaders to either work together or be in conflict with each other. And it's really interesting stuff. There's a ton of stuff in this book on economics and taxes and government spending and tariffs and demographics, agriculture, food quantities and prices. These are some of the unsexy things that often don't get talked about in history enough, but these are the trends and forces that are impacting human behavior. And you don't really have great men or great women or great leaders without these trends and forces acting on them. He talks a lot about disease, how a interconnected world of trade and commerce can oftentimes simply mean the spread of disease. I'm going to read a section of the book here that ties together a lot of this type of stuff. And honestly, this would fit in with a real history book if you took out some of the Westeros-based landmarks and names and things like that. He says, quote, "The winter of 59 to 60 AC was an exceptionally cruel one. All those who survived it agreed. The North was hit first and hardest, as crops died in the field, streams froze, and bitter winds came howling over the wall. Though Lord Alaric Stark had commanded that half of every harvest be preserved and put aside against the coming winter, not all his bannermen had obeyed. As their larders and granaries emptied, famine spread across the land, and old men bade farewell to their children and went out into the snow to die so their kin might live. Harvest failed in the riverlands, the westerlands, and the Vale as well, and even down into the Reach. Those who had food began to hoard, and all across the Seven Kingdoms the price of bread began to rise. The price of meat rose even faster, and in towns and cities fruits and vegetables all but disappeared. And then the shivers came, and the stranger walked the land. The maesters knew the shivers. They had seen its like before a century ago, and the course of the contagion was written in their books. It was believed to have come to Westeros from across the sea, from one of the free cities or lands more distant still. Port cities and harbor towns always felt the hand of the disease first and hardest. Many of the small folk believed that it was carried by rats. Not the familiar gray rats of King's Landing and Old Town, big and bold and vicious, but the smaller black rats that could be seen swarming from the holds of ships at dock and scurrying down the ropes that held them fast. Though the guilt of rats was never proved to the satisfaction of the Citadel, suddenly every house in the Seven Kingdoms, from the grandest castle to the humblest hut, required a cat. Before the shivers ran its course that winter, kittens were selling for as much as horses. The marks of the disease were well known. It began simply enough with a chill. Victims would complain of being cold, throw a fresh log on the fire, huddle under a blanket or a pile of furs. Some would call for hot soup, mulled wine, or against all reason, beer. Neither blankets nor soups could stay the progress of the pestilence. Soon the shivering would begin, mild at first, a trembling, a shudder, but inexorably growing worse. Goose prickles would march up and down the victim's limbs like conquering armies. By then, the afflicted would be shivering so violently that their teeth would chatter, and their hands and feet would begin to convulse and twitch. When the victim's lips turned blue and he began to cough up blood, the end was nigh. Once the first chill was felt, the course of the shivers was swift. Death could come within a day, and no more than one victim in every 5 recovered. All this the maesters knew. What they did not know is where the shivers came from, how to stop it, or how to cure it." End quote. I like this section of the book because it shows how a lot of the unsexy things that we've been talking about actually have a big impact on history. So in that section, you have environmental stuff going on, you have famine going on. This has impact on economics. Then you have disease coming in that's changing demographics, and all of these things are working together to impact human behavior. And these are the types of things that a real historian would study. Another theme of historical study that I think is true is that wars often get precedence over other events in history. There's something about the nature of war that interests people, and oftentimes those types of stories get told in favor of other types of history. Cultural history, gender history, economic history, and so on. And true to fashion, George R.R. Martin has a ton of war in this book. The first 40 pages of the book are action-packed, but I like how he also talks about the idea of governance, the types of things that governments do, fostering commerce and trade, forging unity through laws and relationships, attempting to show tolerance to conquered peoples by allowing them to maintain laws and customs as long as they pledge fealty to the throne, pulling together common defense and military spending on walls and keeps and castles, using religion as a way to try to tie the common folk together to the kingdom, using religion and economics as anchors for stability and legitimacy. These are all based in real historical things that have happened and real historical ideas. So I like that even though the book is called Fire and Blood, George R.R. Martin spends as much time talking about war as he does about everyday governance and the types of things that a state might do to grease its wheels. Another theme of history that George R.R. Martin touches on in the book, and that we've talked about a little bit here, is this question of how do we summarize or characterize long periods of history, especially if they're presided over by one continuous empire or one continuous ruler or one group. For example, if you read about the Ottoman Empire, this is one continuous empire that rules a large area for close to 500 years. And you'll probably read that they were mostly tolerant and mostly peaceful towards people of other religions. But what about the Armenian genocide? What about the wars with the Safavids? Who determines what the norm of a phrase like mostly peaceful or mostly tolerant or mostly warlike? Who determines what that means, and how do we make sense of variations from the norm? And at what point are variations from the norm bad enough to totally negate the norm? And what role does language and narrative play in these questions and how they end up getting answered over the years through history? Here in the book, George R.R. Martin, through his historian author, is talking about really the main part of the book, which is this incredible civil war between two of the rival factions of House Targaryen. And in the book, it's called The Dance of the Dragons. He says, quote, "The Dance of the Dragons is the flowery name bestowed upon the savage internecine struggle for the Iron Throne of Westeros fought between two rival branches of House Targaryen during the years 129 to 131 AC. To characterize the dark, turbulent, bloody doings of this period as a dance strikes us as grotesquely inappropriate. No doubt the phrase originated with some singer. The dying of the dragons would be altogether more fitting, but tradition, time, and Grandmaster Munken have burned the more poetic usage into the pages of history, so we must dance along with the rest. End quote. There you have it. Flowery language surrounding war and death, and it seems like at a certain point in the long historical narrative, for practical or other reasons, you just have to roll with it. And to me, this illustrates another big theme of historical storytelling and really the importance of history as a whole to governments and states and peoples, is that history can be a weapon. One interpretation of something like nationalism might be a group that shares a certain history. And if you can get people together believing in the same history, believing in the same past, then you can move them forward in the direction that you want them to go in the future. So this might be why in this book and in real life, you have history from so many different perspectives, so many storytellers telling things in the way that might fit their own interests, their own biases, their own points of view. And then as a historian, you have to try to piece all those things together in the best way that you can. The last theme of history, and maybe even lesson of history, that George R.R. Martin definitely keeps in mind in this book, but really in my opinion throughout all of his books, is the importance of remembering ordinary people in history. And remembering that it's not just the great men and women of the time period that make history happen, and it's not just the systems and trends and forces that are making things happen. Oftentimes, what we would think of as regular, ordinary people play a bigger role in history than you might think. There are common people who end up becoming hugely important figures, people like Martin Luther or Sulla or Frederick Douglass. But there are also collections of ordinary people who, acting together, make incredible impacts in ways that often aren't fully recognized. So there can be that bias in historical storytelling towards the so-called great people of history, and you have to keep that in mind. And it's something I definitely keep in mind as I try to do this podcast. So I think we'll end things here with George R.R. Martin, again, through his character, talking about that here. And he says, quote, "So much of history tells of the deeds of kings and queens, high lords and noble knights, holy septons, and wise meisters, that it is easy to forget the common folk who shared these times with the great and the mighty. Yet from time to time, some ordinary man or woman, blessed with neither birth, nor wealth, nor wit, nor wisdom, nor skill at arms, will somehow rise up and by some simple act or whispered word change the destiny of kingdoms." If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe on Patreon for bonus episodes and other perks. You can also join the Patreon for free to get a monthly recommendations email and a sneak peek at what's up next. You can support in other ways, of course, by leaving a rating or review in your podcast app, by following on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, etc., by sharing with a friend, or simply by continuing to listen. You can also sign up for the email newsletter that I've been working on. Links to all of this stuff are in the show notes. Any comments or suggestions you can send to reflectinghistory@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. As always, that's it for now.